Start recording here. Hi, everybody. Welcome to what is probably going to be the first of a few webinars for the Virtual Student Cluster Competition and the Cloud Component at SC20. My name is Andy Howard. I'm a program manager on the Azure HPC team. Today, we're going to have a kind of a short presentation followed by a Q&A session. If you have questions as we're going along, feel free to put those in chat. We'll also pause at a couple of points in the presentation to ask any or to let you ask any questions. We are recording, and after the webinar, we'll go ahead and post the recording in these slides on the webinars page. We will have more, as I said, webinars with some more details about how Azure is being incorporated in the competition and some of the details around budget and access and all of that later. So for the webinar today, we're going to go over what HPC on Azure even is, what do we have to offer. After that, we'll talk about how you guys are going to get access to these cloud environments, what your budgets will be both for testing and for the competition itself, and then kind of a just general forum for you guys to ask any questions you might have. I will preface this with saying that we are still working as a committee to try and figure out all of the details around this competition, since this was kind of a last-minute change. So we'll try and get you guys that information as soon as we have it. So let's talk about HPC on Azure. So this is a little bit more of a marketing slide, but I thought this build out was automated. I did want to highlight that at Azure we do focus on HPC as a prioritized workload, and when I say that, I mean we don't just design general purpose compute hardware and then try and run HPC on top of it. We've got an engineering team made up of mostly HPC professionals who have industry experience actually designing and building HPC clusters, whether that's in private industry or national labs and supercomputing centers. And then that expertise also extends to our sales teams, our customer advisory teams. And so we really do try and bring an end-to-end HPC and AI solutions to customers, and bring all of the flexibility that the cloud has to offer. So when we talk about the specialized compute on top of Azure, we have at the bottom of this slide is kind of more of our general purpose VM types, things that are more designed for web servers, SAP installations, Exchange, your typical enterprise data center needs. And then at the top, we have more of our specialized compute for both high performance computing and AI workflows. The boxes that you see in red are essentially the hardware types that you guys are going to have access to for the competition itself. You may not have access to everything inside of those boxes, but mostly wanted to highlight what's explicitly not going to be available. You're not going to have access to Cray in Azure. You're probably not going to have access to FPGA instances, but you will have access to at least a good portion of the HPC VM offerings that we have. So let's look at these in a little more detail. So the first series of VMs that you're probably going to be interested in is the HSeries VMs. These are accelerated, basically CPU-only VMs. And we have kind of two families here. We have the HB, which is designed and optimized for memory bandwidth workflows, and HC, which is designed more for the compute optimized workflows. So things that aren't necessarily as memory intensive, but may need the fastest processors that we have. So if we look at kind of the more detailed view here, HBV2 is our latest HPC VM type that we have. It's based off of AMD Rome architecture. It has 200 gig HDR InfiniBand and about 4 gigs of memory per core. Similar to that, we have the HB, which was basically just the generation before HBV2. Both of those are kind of the memory bandwidth optimized offerings that we have. And then we have the HC line, which is our Intel Skylake offering. And it has, if you notice, it's got a little more memory per core because it's not really optimized for that memory bandwidth need. Both HB and HC have 100 gig EDR InfiniBand. And then finally, we have our HV1, which is kind of our legacy HPC offering. That is based off of an older Haswell architecture. The main reason why I included on this slide is because the memory per core is significantly higher than the other offerings. So depending on the work that you actually, or the the model that you're actually working with, sometimes this is still an attractive offering just because it does have a large amount of memory and 2 terabytes of local storage on it. The caveat to HV1 is that it does have older 56 gig FDR InfiniBand. And currently, and I don't know if this is going to be rolled out before the competition or addressed before the competition or not. Currently, that InfiniBand only supports Intel MPI 5.1, and you can't do general like IP over IB with it. So it is a very limited InfiniBand capability. For HB, HC, and HBV2, that is a fully, full InfiniBand stack with IP over IB enabled. You can use pretty much any modern variant of MPI with it, and it'll work. And this slide is just kind of to put into context what we've designed these VM types to actually target. These are really targeted towards hardware that's similar to what you would probably be bringing to the competition anyways. So, really targeting what people are putting in data centers today, not just what other cloud providers are putting out there for customers. As far as scalability goes, this is one of the things that we really try and focus on as we design this hardware, is that we're not just designing for synthetic benchmarks. We design for real world workloads. So this is running CP2K on up to 22,000 cores in Azure. And you can see we had, pretty much near linear scaling here, which was pretty great to see, especially as our first round of our next gen HPC architecture that we rolled out. The other hardware type that a lot of you I know are probably really interested in, especially looking at the architectures that are usually proposed for the competition. We do have a lot of different GPU offerings, everything from visualization and gaming to kind of your more traditional HPC simulation, and then all the way through to deep learning and AI offerings. For the most part, for the competition, you guys are probably not going to be looking at the NV series just because the visualization acceleration isn't really going to help you much from the competition standpoint. You're probably going to be more interested in NC and ND series. So let's look at those a little bit. Similar to the HB family, we've got, the naming conventions here kind of matter. So NC is actually, denotes that these are general purpose GPU compute VMs. And then ND is more targeted towards deep learning. And we'll see that in the types of GPUs that are available in those VMs. So this is kind of looking at our GPU offerings year over year. And the key point of this slide is that we're constantly rolling out new GPU hardware to keep up with what's latest and greatest in the industry. You'll notice in 2020, targeted towards the end of this year, it's currently in private preview. We already have an A100 VM type. Those were just announced a few months ago by NVIDIA. So we are trying to stay on top of whatever the latest and greatest hardware is. It's highly unlikely that we'll be able to get teams access to the NDV4 A100 instances for the competition. I'm going to try, but currently our capacity there is just very limited because it's still private preview. But for the most part, if you're looking at GPUs, you're probably going to be staying more in the NCV3 and NDV2 side of things, because those are kind of the latest generation Volta GPUs that are available. The big difference between the NCV3 and NDV2 is the NCV3 has an older InfiniBand architecture. NDV2 has the latest EDR InfiniBand. Also, the NCV3 has the 16 gig GPU configuration, and the NDV2 has 32 gigs of memory per GPU. And this is just a little more information about the NDV2 itself. And again, as I said, you've got NVLink, HDR or EDR InfiniBand, about 1.5 terabytes of solid state drive local to the node. And then these are the 32 gigabyte GPU cards. And one thing, as we work with customers on this, we obviously have a lot of GPUs GPU VMs to offer. And so it can be a little confusing sometimes to know where to start. So this is just kind of a general slide that we use, a workflow decision tree that we use to help customers land on the appropriate VM type for their workflow needs. Whether they're doing inference and training, whether they're doing HPC or they're doing rendering. So kind of use this as a guide when you're going through and exploring and testing things to figure out what might be the right fit for your problem. I know some of you are familiar with what these different GPU types have to offer because you've already spec'd them out for your own clusters, but this is just kind of another place for you to, another quick reference point for you to see what's available. I'm going to go ahead and pause there and ask if there are any questions from the HPC hardware side as far as what's available on Azure. Again, you may not have access to everything that we have in the portfolio, but you'll have access to a good portion of it. All right, I don't see any questions in, oh. Lisa's asking, will we know before the competition what we will have access to? Yes, you will know probably within a couple of weeks after you get access to the test environments, and we'll talk a little bit about how testing is going to work a little bit later. But you'll have access to essentially the same stuff you'll have access to for the competition, just at a smaller scale. Great question. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the HPC software, and we're going to cover kind of what Azure has to offer in general, and then what's more relevant to the competition itself. So obviously all this great hardware is awesome to have, but unless you can actually leverage it effectively, it's kind of useless. So we have a bunch of different services and products that we offer to help manage and run HPC workloads on top of Azure. The oldest of which is probably HPC Pack. This is more of an HPC scheduler, goes back about a decade or so. Most customers typically run HPC Pack on-premise. Some of them still run it in Azure to kind of lift and shift those on-prem workloads to the cloud. For the most part, though, for newer customers that are actually looking at cloud migrations, they're probably targeting either Azure Batch, which you can think of as HPC Jobs as a Service. It's really a cloud native scheduler and resource manager combined into one. And then Azure Cycle Cloud, which is designed to be a tool for managing traditional HPC clusters as kind of a first-class service on top of Azure. Azure Cycle Cloud is actually the tool you guys will be using for interacting with Azure. We'll get into some details about that in a second. I did want to mention that we do offer Azure Kubernetes service as well for running containerized workloads. You won't have access to that for the competition. So as I mentioned, Cycle Cloud is really designed for running traditional HPC environments that users are often used to today. So it enables them to take the same scripts and workloads that they're used to working with and the same scheduling environments and file system layouts and usernames and everything you can think of, and basically have that same experience on top of the cloud while still being able to take advantage of the scalability of the cloud. So we do have native integration with a lot of HPC schedulers to do auto scale up and down based on the demand of the job queue. And it also helps from a cluster management perspective, both for the IT team and the business side, to make sure that you can control the security and architecture and even limit the scale. Because at the end of the day, you do need to be able to control the cost of the compute environment. And that cost control is really one of the main reasons why we're using Cycle Cloud for the competition itself. It gives us a lot more insight than what the Azure platform gives us access to in terms of cost reporting and control at a cluster level. So these are the schedulers that we currently have autoscale integration with in CycleCloud today. Now, I do want to point out that while these are the things that we ship with out of the box in CycleCloud, you really don't have to use our scheduler support. It is entirely possible to provision and orchestrate just a set of VMs from CycleCloud itself and treat them kind of as a bare bones cluster. So after we get you guys access to CycleCloud, we'll do another webinar that's kind of more of a deep dive tutorial on how to use CycleCloud and how to customize these clusters. And I'll talk about how you can basically run without a scheduler in either a completely headless configuration where you just have execute nodes, or in a more traditional, you have a head node and a shared file system, but maybe not a scheduler for doing things. So this is where I'm sure a lot of you guys will have questions, and this is also where we're still working on a lot of the details with the committee, and that is around budgets and access to the environment. So one thing that we do know for certain, so in previous competitions, in previous years, the cloud component has been kind of a supplemental piece to the cluster that you would bring to the competition. And as a result, we never really set testing budgets for the teams. It was kind of a don't go too crazy, don't try and spend too much, and make sure you shut down things that aren't being utilized. A lot of times I would have to go and nag teams to start shutting things down because at the end of the day, we do have a fixed budget for the entire competition, so we need to make sure that we stay within those bounds. So this year we're changing things a little bit. You will have essentially testing budgets for each month leading up to the competition. So that is to say, once you guys have access to these environments, for the first month, you'll have a certain dollar amount that you'll be allowed to spend. The second month, you'll have another dollar amount, and then those will be separate from your actual competition budgets. Those testing budgets may change, depending on the month. We may keep them the same. These are some details that we're still trying to figure out. I see a question in chat. Can we know the approximate monthly budget? That's something that we're still trying to nail down the details. We just finally got budget approval for some of this stuff, so we're trying to figure out what we can actually give each of the teams, both for testing and for the competition. So the goal is by September 11th, we will announce via the Google Groups what the monthly budgets, at least the testing budgets, will be after we've decided on that as a committee. When it comes to actually monitoring what you're spending, there's kind of two main tools that you can use, both to approximate what you will spend and also what you have spent so far. So inside of CycleCloud, when you select what VM types you actually want in your cluster, we do provide a breakdown of both the cost per hour and the cost per core to run, the cost per VM, which is what this dollars per hour is, and the cost per core per hour, to kind of make those estimates a little bit easier for you as you're actually deploying the hardware. I find this really useful when I'm just playing around with different VM types and don't necessarily want to bounce back and forth between CycleCloud and the pricing pages. But we do have a pricing calculator on the Azure website. Link is in here. We'll share these slides after the webinar so that you can get to that. CycleCloud also does provide both at a cluster level and a node level what the current spending rate is and what you spent over the last 24, 72 hours and I think 30 days. Looks like we got a question from Sam. Does the budget roll over or use it or lose it? For the testing budget, it's basically going to be use it or lose it. For the competition, all of the budgets will reset. So yeah, you basically use the budgets that we give you, and yeah, otherwise you don't get it back. Another question, will we be charged for ingress and egress? Because that's really hard for us to actually track and label due to the way we're setting this up, you would normally be charged for ingress and egress, and you will be charged, or sorry, I should say, the sponsored subscription will be charged for it, but we're not going to hold teams accountable for that. So the main things that, and honestly, it's usually a fraction of the cost of the total bill anyways. The main things that you guys will have to budget for is the compute and any storage that's attached to the compute? It's a great question, though. So as I mentioned earlier, the main way, or really the only way that you guys are going to be able to interact with Azure itself is through CycleCloud. This is similar to what we've done in previous years. One thing that I really wanted to highlight, and I'll mention this again on the Google group and when we do the CycleCloud webinar, CycleCloud does have the ability to attach public IPs to your clusters. I highly recommend that you disable that functionality, and I'll show you how to do that. And I also highly recommend not to enable password logins on your clusters. We've had issues with this in the past for the physical clusters people bring to the competition, where they'll accidentally open up firewall ports or accidentally expose services that they don't really think about, and then all of a sudden their cluster gets compromised. As you can imagine, the Azure IP space is of a lot of interest of a lot of bad actors, and so it's constantly attacked. And while our security teams do what they can to try and prevent any attacks that we know or can detect the pattern of, I will say I've personally seen VMs with reasonably complex passwords that were compromised within a matter of hours after they were deployed. So stick to SSH keys. It's what we enable by default in CycleCloud and the HPC images. Don't go and turn on passwords. Your access to Azure will be restricted to basically a single resource group. That'll all be configured for you ahead of time. I just wanted to point that out for anybody who's been kind of researching Azure on their own and has run into some of these logical constructs that we have. So you'll have a dedicated VNet, you'll have a dedicated resource group, and you'll be completely sandboxed off from the other teams. Going back to the quota question earlier, we'll basically set the quotas ahead of the competition, and we'll also ensure that whatever quotas we do set are in line with whatever budget you're getting, so that no one team can basically monopolize the amount of compute in a single region. That's always been a concern in the past, and we'll continue to make sure that we keep things as fair as they can be. One thing I did want to highlight, and we're going to have, after you guys get some testing time, we're asking that teams actually propose what their cloud architecture will look like in terms of the VM types that they want access to and the scale that they need. Again, during testing, we're going to set some reasonable quotas here so that everybody has access to a little bit of everything. But those quotas will be lower than during the actual competition. We'll try and address that as much as possible. As far as when you'll get access, my goal is to have all of this set up and have everybody access, at least have the advisors have access login information by September 21st. Mary's asking, in the past, we brought a physical machine to the SCC, and once you qualify, there are no changes. So this year, because of the fact that part of the nature of the cloud and part of the benefit of using the cloud is that you can actually tailor your hardware needs to the workload. And because the limit this year is not necessarily a power constraint, but it's a budget constraint, you are allowed to change the hardware configuration of your machine while it's running. What you won't be able to do is, if you've proposed a certain architecture and asked for a certain quota, you won't be able to, during the competition, to all of a sudden, email me and ask me to increase the quota some more. So you will have to stick to kind of the set of hardware that you've expected to use. So bear that in mind as you're kind of preparing for things. And just because I know we're going to get the question, why CycleCloud? Why not give everybody access to their own, sponsored Azure subscription and let you use, whatever services you want to? Quite frankly, it comes down to a couple of things. One, it's a lot easier for the committee to set up and manage, and not just from the setup standpoint of initializing all of this stuff, but keeping insights as to what's actually being spent, in total. These are sponsored subscriptions, so they're dealt with a little bit differently on the Azure side. It's also a lot easier for teams to get started without having to go and read all of the Azure documentation or get familiar with some of the the nitty-gritty details of things like placement groups and VM scale sets and how do I attach disks and networking. We have a fairly robust template system inside of CycleCloud that lets you do most of that customization. It also gets you auto scaling to help control costs. Another thing, and I probably should have put this on this slide, but CycleCloud does support using spot VMs, which I definitely encourage you, especially while you're doing your testing, to use spot VMs as much as possible for your compute. Essentially, we have a couple of different billing rates inside of Azure. The normal pricing is what we call pay as you go. And that's the dollar amount that you'll see if you just sign up for an Azure account and start deploying VMs. That's the rate that you're going to pay. Spot VMs are essentially a fraction of a cost. You could see anywhere between a 40 to 90% discount on your hourly rate for spot VMs. The caveat, of course, is that we can basically evict you at any time from the spot VMs if we need the capacity back. So I don't recommend spot VMs for things like head nodes and scheduler nodes and login nodes, things that are going to be persistent. But especially while you're testing, if you're running an MPI job across a couple of nodes for, say 4 or 5 hours, spot VMs are a great way to stretch that budget and make sure that you can get as much testing done as possible. And then another big choice for using CycleCloud is we do get more real-time cost reporting. The Azure billing, especially for sponsored subscriptions, can have a huge delay. And so this gives us an easier way to see not just at a cluster level, but also in each team's entire environment, what the spend has been so far. And then similar to previous years, I will have a plugin installed that lets teams actually query their total Azure spend for the month, or the current budget period, I guess, and then the current hourly and minute burn rates. And if you want to kind of get a jump start before you get access and start reading about CycleCloud, there's a link here to the docs page for CycleCloud. Looks like we got a few more questions here. Spot pricing will be available. So spot pricing is available for both the competition and during testing. So you can use spot VMs. That being said, if you get evicted from your VMs during the competition, I mean, that's money that you spent. So if you do get evicted, you're not going to get a credit to your spend. That's basically a risk reward thing there. Spot availability for HBV2, HC, and NC. That's a great question. So it is going to vary a little bit. HBV2 and HC in particular are probably not going to have a problem. NC, it depends a little bit on which one you're talking about. And the main reason here is that, as you can imagine, the latest and greatest GPU instances cost a lot of money for us to run. An 8 V100 cards and the hardware to run it is not cheap for us to have idle. So those do have slightly more limited capacity. I don't have any insight as to what the availability is in terms of, can you get spot VMs? Can you not get spot VMs? So it's going to be one of those things you're just going to have to try it and see. So that's the main prepared content for the webinar. I mean, at this point, it's kind of open for Q&A. We've got a couple of great questions so far. Main takeaways in terms of dates, again, by next Friday, September 11th, we're hoping to have the actual budgets announced, at least for testing. And then by the week and a half later, I think it's the 24th or 21st, hope to have access to the actual clusters or the actual CycleCloud installs. You know the date for CycleCloud webinar? Not yet. I was just telling Steve before this started, I've got to sit down with him and nail down a date. It will be basically, hopefully within a week or two after you guys all get access to your CycleCloud installs. I want everybody to have a chance to kind of verify that they can log in. That way, if you want to try anything during the webinar, you can. Or if you have specific questions about CycleCloud. When you'll have to provide your cloud configuration. Scott, I don't remember if we've set a hard date for that yet or not.
We have not set a hard date for that, but it will be in the same time range when the final hardware architecture had been required in the past. So in the late September, early October type time frame. We'd like to give you as much time as possible to test some of these configurations. So it may be as late as mid to late October.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, most of that is really just so that we can make sure that I have time to work with our capacity management team to ensure all the quotas get increased. Do we have the same? Do we have to use the same cloud configuration for all applications, or can we propose different configurations for different applications? You can definitely propose different configurations for different applications. That's kind of the goal in using the cloud for this, is that you do have a little bit more flexibility there. Martin's asking if API access will be available. Can you clarify what you mean by API access? Is that the CycleCloud API or the Azure API? Okay, you won't have that direct access to the Azure API. That's essentially going to be brokered by CycleCloud. But CycleCloud does have a full REST API that you can interact with to start and stop things on demand. Good question, though. Are we allowed to prepare a storage space with pre-installed applications before the competition? Yeah, so similar to previous year's competitions, essentially the test environment that you have, the clusters that you deploy, all the running hardware, assuming you still have budget to keep it running, all of that will still be available to you during the competition. So you can definitely take this testing time to prepare your software stack on NFS share or whatever, however you want to manage that, and keep that same configuration during the competition itself. Essentially, when the competition starts, we just reset the timers on reset the budget dollar amounts. Just to clarify, we get access to CycleCloud. So you'll get access to CycleCloud again on September 21st or before then. I'll send out login information to all the advisors at the same time. The testing budget you'll get access to by September 11th after we finalize it with the committee. Mary's asking, can you expand on what resources have a quota? All resources in Azure have a quota, to put it bluntly. I don't know exactly what those quotas will be yet for the testing environment. That's something I have to work with capacity planning on, because these are sponsored subscriptions. They do take kind of lower priority sometimes than paying customers. Will there be a separate budget for the benchmarking applications versus the rest, or just one fixed budget? It's just going to be one budget. So you have $1 amount allocation for the whole competition. So it's going to be kind of up to each of the teams to decide how much you want to spend optimizing for benchmarks or how much you want to spend on the actual applications. Will there be a power outage equivalent for the cloud? Great question. I don't think we have one planned at the moment.
Andy, can you unplug all the data centers for us?
Yeah, we'll just take out an Azure region. Oh, that's actually one, mentioning Azure regions, that's one thing that I do want to point out. All of the teams will be deployed in the same Azure region to keep pricing fair. All of our regions have different pricing because it costs different amounts to run in different data centers. So we will have everybody limited to 1 or 2 regions, depending on the availability. There is a chance that depending on capacity for some of the more limited or some of the more specialty hardware, that we may end up, similar to previous years, having to deploy some infrastructure or give you access to some infrastructure in a different region and basically do the VNet peering for those. Mary, no, there's no power limit. The power limit equivalent is going to be the budget itself. So the budget's kind of the equivalent there. Which region will we all be using? That's still up in the air. It's most likely going to be South Central US. But again, I need to work with capacity management to make sure that we can get access for all of you guys. Any other questions? Will there be, great question, Lisa. Yes, there will be a webinar on benchmarking in Azure. I'm working with Steve to schedule that. It's probably going to be sometime in October. And we do have an Azure HPC benchmarking team, so I'm hoping to get one or two of them to join and basically give you guys some tips and tricks on both the synthetic benchmarks and also just optimizing other applications for running on top of Azure. If we use up our test budget in one of the months, can we use our own budget? So your teams can go and sign up for an Azure subscription. What you won't be able to do is essentially top up the sponsored account that you get access to. So once you've used up your budget, we will turn off the resources that you have running in Azure. They will be deallocated. I'm not going to completely terminate things like head nodes because otherwise we delete the root volume and that's never good. So we will basically deallocate them to reduce cost for the overall budget. But can you comment on, so for the physical competition, usually we would have an NFS server that was local to the network. For the cloud competition, we will have essentially in an Azure subscription, all the infrastructure that we would normally deploy as a committee on the show floor. So we will have kind of that equivalent. It's most likely that the data sets are going to be put in an Azure Blob storage account, and you'll all get access to that, read access to that, and then you'll also have separate storage account containers that you'll have write access to turn in results. I think this will be the first competition where the result upload won't be limited to a gig. Scott, did you have anything else you wanted to add while we wait to see if there's any final questions here?
No, I think you covered it pretty well, Andy. The only thing I would add is that, as Andy mentioned, a lot of these details we are still hammering out, and I think both Veronica and I are very grateful to all of you for being flexible and enthusiastic and willing to participate. And so, if please do be as understanding as possible as we're adapting to this change. We know that you are as well, and we will communicate things to all of you via the Google group as soon as we know, you will know.
Veronica, I'm not sure if you meant to request control of my screen or if that was a misclick. I don't know if you have anything. I didn't see you joined. If you have anything to add there.
Oh, I put it in chat, but no, I did not mean to steal your screen.
We expect large data upload times when Azure region is being far away from our physical location. So that's a good question. And this is unfortunately where to keep the competition fair, we do have to keep everybody in a single region. I realize that that's, puts some teams at a little bit of a disadvantage in terms of total connectivity to the Azure environment. For the most part, the furthest your traffic would usually have to go is to wherever the nearest connection to the Microsoft backbone is. We basically try and optimize that routing so that as much traffic as possible goes over the Azure backbone instead of the public internet. So I would hope that you shouldn't have too much of a large data set upload time. If we see some problems with that, we'll definitely try and find a solution there. It may be that for those teams that are having issues uploading, we deploy a second Bastion VM in a region that's closer to you to at least upload that data to.
And as Andy pointed out, like for the competition, all of the data sets
right.
will be in Azure in the same area that your VMs are at. So there won't actually be, you shouldn't have to upload large data sets, say from your home institution. For the testing part, if you do experience issues, if you're getting some data sets that you're downloading from the internet or trying to upload from your home institution, then do make us aware of that on the Google group, and we can investigate and see if we can improve that.
Will the CycleCloud Premium be waived for the competition? So 2 points there. One, CycleCloud is a free product, and so there is no license fee. There's no additional cost for using it. The CycleCloud, the cost of the VM that's going to be running CycleCloud and acting as your Bastion host will not be included in your budget. Basically, we're giving that to you. Good question, though. And again, if you want to go and get started on your own, if your institution does have an Azure subscription or you have a personal, I believe anybody with a .edu address can get some Azure credit, and CycleCloud is something you can install and run on any. You can run it locally on your laptop if you want to. Can the Bastion VM be used as a head node then? So it can, in the sense of it can be a point for you to log in, but no, you can't run, you won't be able to run compute workloads on it. I will be keeping a fairly close eye on the utilization of that VM. It's not free compute for you. It's really just meant as a point for you to log in and submit or start your clusters. And they're not going to be very powerful VMs anyways. You release how each application is weighted in terms of score. Scott or Veronica, I don't know if you have input on that one.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. Yes, we will let you know the scoring rubric ahead of time in terms of how, for example, the benchmarks and each of the individual applications will factor into the score overall. In addition, we will have some replacements for the posters and other on the show floor. I would encourage you all to take a look at the conference website. There is going to be a lot of cool some opportunities for teams to present via that venue. As we get more details about how that process of uploading and posting presentations and posters actually works with the platform that the conference is using, we'll let all of you know and let you know how that's going to count towards your overall score. Good question.
Yeah, Lisa, great question about going over budget during the competition. The rules will most likely be similar to previous years where, yeah, it's kind of a sliding scale. So a certain amount over budget, if you're within, these numbers aren't final, by the way, but just as an example, for last year's competition, I think if you were $10 over budget, it was just kind of excused. If you went $15 or $20 over budget, there was a point deduction. And then if you go over a certain amount, I mean, if you're spending $100 an hour and you go $100 over budget, I mean, that was just you not paying attention. So at a certain point, yeah, you'll lose enough points that it's essentially the same as being disqualified. Could you clarify what you meant earlier by being evicted from your VM? Sure. So if you're using spot VMs and a customer that's paid for either reserved instances or is paying the pay-as-you-go rate requests that VM type, and we don't have enough capacity in the pay-as-you-go pool to service that, then we'll actually start evicting spot VMs, and so you will basically lose. We basically deprovision the VM, so you will no longer have access to it. It's sort of like the power outage, yeah. And similar to the real world in the cloud, you don't get control over whether you get evicted or not, and there's nothing I can do to control whether you get evicted or not. If you opt into using Spot, that's life if you get evicted. Similarly, is there some kind of failover mechanism for that? No, there's not a failover. CycleCloud will try and provision a new VM to replace that capacity. Again, this is kind of some of the fancy auto scale functionality that you'll get. But again, if the capacity is not there, then we won't be able to allocate anything. Azure does provide a signal to VMs prior to eviction. It's not a very, you don't get a whole lot of heads up. Last I checked, it was a 30-second warning. So it's a little bit tricky to catch in something like a cron job. Similar to spot evictions, at the end of the day, all of these VMs are running on real physical hardware. It is possible for you to get bad hardware sometimes or to have hardware fail. For the most part, host migrations do take place, and so there is some resiliency there. But similar to the hardware you bring to the competition, if it fails during the competition, we're not going to credit you for that. And so it is one of those. This is a real world scenario. And so that's what would happen in real life. Where is the eviction notification? I can point you to the documentation for that. It's basically stored at the node's metadata API. Yeah, Lewis, great point. If there are definitely great spot use cases and there are some not as great spot use cases. I will say, in a lot of my testing, I've successfully run, shorter MPI jobs, where shorter here means even, 4 to 6 hours on top of spot VMs, just because the capacity was there, it was stable, and so you can get away with that. And it's definitely one of those. I would encourage you while you're testing to see what you can get away with spot VMs, because they're a really powerful tool, and for the most part, especially on like the normal HC HBV2, HB VMs, eviction rates can be pretty low sometimes. Can we run the benchmarking concurrently on spot instances and regular instances and pick and choose scores?
So I think I can field this
Sure.
one. So in the past, we had a benchmarking day and a applications. The time was separated. For this competition, the entire time you can be running benchmarks or applications. The real ceiling is the amount of budget that you have. And so one thing that we're looking at is allowing people to get be able to submit and then resubmit both for the as you could do for the benchmarks in the past, but also for the applications. So we're going to be trying to do a little bit of automated scoring. There will likely be you will not be able to get full points for your second and third and fourth submission. So you can't just keep submitting, trying to get a higher score. So for the benchmarking, you will be able to submit multiple times. And if you can get a better run, you should do that for a higher score. But I think Andy alluded to this earlier. It's all a matter of how you're using that budget that you have for the competition.
Yeah.
So, in fact, you could use a lot of your budget towards benchmarking and probably get a very large number for LinPack, for example. But then there's not much left to do the rest of the applications.
Yeah, and just to also clarify on the difference between spot VMs and normal or pay-as-you-go VMs, under the hood, they are the exact same hardware. So you're not necessarily going to get better numbers from pay-go VM than you would from a spot VM. It's really just a billing construct and the ability for us to evict the VM. So otherwise, they're identical hardware. Lewis, no, we don't publish any data on eviction rates. In fact, even within the company, that can be pretty difficult to get access to. That's definitely something, though, that I would encourage you as you're doing your testing and using spot VMs, you may be able to find patterns there. Yep, it's totally worth asking. It's a great question. Our customers ask that all the time. I would love for the ability to do that, honestly. We've got a few minutes left. Are there any last questions? Are your VMs specified in terms of physical cores or virtual? That's a great question, Mary. It depends a little bit on the VM type. So I will say for all of our HPC VMs, and that's both H-series and N-series, we do not enable hyperthreading. And if you get a core, it's a core under the hood. Similarly, for like if you look really closely at the processors that we say we have in the VMs and the number of cores that we expose, for all of our HPC VM types, we actually hold back a few cores from the VM for the hypervisor so that we reduce the amount of impact that the hypervisor has on the actual bare metal. So anytime we talk about number of cores for HPC hardware, that is physical cores. There are some VM types where if you go to the node details page, you'll see the cores are specified as vCPUs. Those have hyperthreading turned on. Looks like Sam has a question around the, oh, there we go. Veronica answered that in chat. Students need to be available November 8th through the 11th. All right. I think that about wraps it up. Again, Look for announcements on the Google group around testing budgets. If your advisor is not on this call, make sure you let them know. We'll also send a note out to the Google group to look for login info by September 21st. And we'll let you guys know about future webinars around using CycleCloud and benchmarking. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.